Listen close, folks, pull your chair up, because what just blew a crater through the executive skeleton of the music business is not a rap feud. It's not a diss record. It's not a shady Instagram caption thrown up at 3 in the morning. What actually went down is a full-scale corporate burial dressed in cufflinks, notarized on a mahogany conference table, and stamped in wet black ink across every square foot of the hip-hop economy. And by the time you finish this breakdown, you're going to understand why every label boss in every mirrored high-rise from Midtown Manhattan to Sunset Boulevard to South Beach to Buckhead to Canary Wharf just quietly told their assistants to hold every call. Because Curtis Jackson didn't just fire another shot at Rick Ross. Curtis Jackson built a trap. He built a trap that swallows empires whole. And Rick Ross walked straight into it on a Tuesday morning, wearing a tailored jacket and a diamond pinky ring, with the whole culture live streaming the moment in razor-sharp 4K. Now hold up, because I already hear you. You're about to type in the comments that this is the same tired 2008 Officer Ricky routine, that this is two grown men who should have hung up the gloves a decade back. I hear that. I really do. But I need you to understand something, and I'm going to say it slow enough that the folks in the back row catch every syllable. The Curtis Jackson who was chasing Rick Ross in 2008 is not the same man breathing today. That version was a rapper with a chip on his shoulder. The Curtis Jackson standing over Rick Ross's industry corpse in 2026 is not a rapper. He's a boardroom operator with production deals wired into Netflix, Amazon, Starz, Lionsgate, Paramount, and 3 separate global content marketplaces I can't name on camera without my lawyers calling. He's on a first-name basis with executives who couldn't hum a Rick Ross hook if their bonus depended on it. He sits in rooms where nobody says the word bar and everybody says the word EBITDA. And the Rick Ross bleeding out on the floor right now is not the Rick Ross who dropped Trilla or Deeper Than Rap either. That man had label muscle behind him. That man had radio programmers on speed dial. That man had a Billboard chart position waiting for him before the album even dropped. The Rick Ross getting stretched out on the boardroom table today is a legacy act with a first-week number under 2,000 sales, an arena tour running at 20% capacity, and you're going to want to hold on to something for this. A debt file that got quietly bought by the man he's been throwing shade at since the Bush administration. I have the paperwork. I have the venue reports. I have the corporate registry polls. Keep your eyes right here, because what surfaced at 5:45 Eastern this afternoon in a Florida filing rewrites who actually owns hip-hop. And it does it without one new bar being spit into a booth. Not one. Not a hook. Not an ad-lib. Just a signature, a filing fee, and a lawyer with a cold Montblanc pen. Let me set the table, because if you don't understand how the ground fractured under Rick Ross's Louboutins, none of what comes next is going to detonate the way it should. Strange, quiet things have been happening around the Maybach Music Organization for the past 90 days, and the mainstream music press missed every signal until the tower came down. Rick Ross rolled out his 12th album with the swagger of a man who still thought he was 15 years younger than he actually is. He wrapped the campaign in a global orchestra tour, hardwood arenas, tuxedo and crystal marketing rollouts, private jet cinematography, imported cognac product placements. He positioned this as his return to the throne. And for about 72 hours, the fantasy held. Then the first week ledger leaked. Under 2,000 pure sales. Read that number twice. Under 2,000. A man who once moved 180,000 units on release day just moved less inventory than an unsigned kid with a viral clip on TikTok. And that leak wasn't the wound. The wound was where the leak landed. It landed in one specific inbox. The executive desk at G-Unit Film and Television. Because Curtis Jackson has been sitting on this exact scenario for 17 years, waiting for the universe to hand him the coordinates. And this week, the universe finally FedExed him the map. Don't get it twisted, folks. Most people think Curtis Jackson is petty. He's not petty. He's patient. That distinction is the whole ballgame, and it's the distinction Rick Ross has been fumbling for a decade and a half. Curtis Jackson has been quietly stacking leverage. Rick Ross has been posting out selfies. When those venue reports started leaking, arenas at 19, 20, 22% capacity, entire front rows papered with 2-for-1 promo codes, Curtis Jackson didn't laugh. He didn't tweet. He didn't record a diss. He closed his laptop, walked into a legal conference room, and issued exactly one instruction. Not a song, not a meme, an instruction. And the moment those words left his mouth, the entire music industry supply chain started rerouting around Rick Ross the way a river reroutes around a boulder that just fell out of the sky. Because here's the piece nobody covered. Curtis Jackson doesn't need to out-rap Rick Ross anymore. Curtis Jackson has been in the business of owning the ground for years. The ground you sign your deals on. The ground you stand on when you cut a check. The ground your tour bus parks on. And when you own the ground, the man walking around on it is already yours. He's already a line item. He's already inventory on somebody else's spreadsheet, and he doesn't even know it yet. Here's where the floor drops out. On Tuesday, before most executives had cracked the lid on their first oat milk latte, a series of confidential legal notices went out from Curtis Jackson's corporate counsel. Those notices landed on the desks of the boards of directors at 3 major distribution networks, 2 international arena conglomerates, and 1 dominant streaming platform. The letters were not aggressive. The letters were not threats. The letters were reminders. Reminders that G-Unit Film and Television's multi-title production pipeline, a pipeline that is currently underwriting a materially significant portion of the streaming and premium cable calendar, could be, quote, reevaluated. In the event that these same partners continued to promote, distribute, host, or amplify Rick Ross's touring calendar and catalog. Run that line back one more time. Because the phrasing there is doing more heavy lifting than any diss track ever could. Curtis Jackson did not ask them to drop Rick Ross. Curtis Jackson asked them to pick. And when you're a boardroom staring down a 9-figure content slate on one side and a 2,000-unit album on the other side, that math is not math. That math is a formality. There's not one executive in that room fighting to protect Rick Ross's tour dates when their own quarterly bonus is sitting in the balance. Not one. Now watch how fast the dominoes fell. By 10 in the morning that same day, an internal memo slipped out of a major international venue booking agency. 3 arena stops on Rick Ross's European and domestic route got flagged and placed on administrative hold pending, quote, a full operational and financial risk audit. The underwriters cited weak advanced ticket velocity and elevated liability exposure, which is the corporate polite way of saying, we are not swallowing a 7-figure loss for a man Curtis Jackson just informally erased. The dominoes were not staggered. They were simultaneous. Streaming playlist placements started vanishing off the new album by lunchtime. Programming executives stopped picking up their phones. Radio spins that were locked in for the weekend got unlocked. Sync deals and active paper went stone cold. And by 2 in the afternoon, William Leonard Roberts II had gone from headlining boss to industry contagion. From a name on a marquee to a red flag on a risk dashboard. From a brand to a cautionary bullet point at a Monday morning executive meeting. That is not editorial spin. That is the timeline. That is what 6 business hours of Curtis Jackson's corporate leverage looks like when it lands in the marketplace. Then Curtis Jackson took his victory lap on camera, because he always takes his victory lap on camera. And this one was cinematic. A single photograph. Curtis Jackson seated at the head of a walnut conference table. 6 executives in bespoke charcoal suits flanking him on both sides. A black leather portfolio splayed open in front of him. A silver fountain pen resting across the top page like a period at the end of a sentence. Caption underneath the photo, 6 words. Told y'all I was cleaning shop. Follow-up post, 30 seconds later. Nobody's booking the fake boss. Labels don't want him. Venues don't want him. The streaming numbers got flagged. Wrap it up, Ricky. Ride's finished. Feel the surgical language on that. Not the ride is done. The ride is finished. Past tense. Declared. Sealed. Curtis Jackson was not predicting Rick Ross's collapse. He was narrating it live. And the culture, the same culture that spent 15 years crowning Rick Ross the biggest boss in the room, didn't rally. It piled on. It piled on hard because the optics were catastrophic. For a decade and a half, Rick Ross told us he was the man running the boardrooms. In one afternoon, Curtis Jackson demonstrated, on the record, who actually walked in, sat at the head chair, and locked the door behind him. That's not a beef. That's a burial. And burials don't get undone with a hot 16. Let me walk you inside the promised land estate down in Georgia, because the human core of this story is sitting there right now. Sources close to Maybach Music describe a scene bordering on straight organizational meltdown. The road manager was on one line. The distribution rep was on another. Event promoters in 5 states were sitting on hold. The catering vendor for the European leg was asking whether to just refund out. The insurance carrier on the tour bond was demanding updated capacity projections in writing before close of business. And planted in the middle of that hurricane, Rick Ross himself, silk robe wrapped around his shoulders, cigar going, cell in one hand, laptop cracked open on the other, trying to hold the mythology together while the mythology got repossessed piece by piece behind his back. Ross did what Ross does. He hit Instagram Live. He aimed the camera up. He set his jaw. And he delivered a monologue that, in any other decade, would have been legendary. He accused Curtis Jackson of running to white executives to shut down black art. He accused Curtis Jackson of pulling dirty Hollywood strings because he couldn't touch him on wax. He called Curtis Jackson an informant in a 2-piece suit. That line would have gone viral in 2009. This decade didn't care. This decade watched a man in a silk robe defending an empire that was actively being liquidated behind him in real time. That's a visual you don't recover from. You cannot rap your way out of a repossession by yelling louder. Follow me here, because this is the piece the podcasts are going to miss. The blacklisting wasn't the story. The blacklisting was the smoke screen. The fire underneath was lit by Curtis Jackson 7 years ago, and everybody forgot he was holding the match. At 2:30 Eastern this afternoon, an entertainment reporter dropped a bombshell that froze every business affairs desk in the industry. Leaked communications between a senior executive at a major distribution conglomerate and Curtis Jackson's legal team revealed the actual mechanism of the takedown. Curtis Jackson's investment vehicle, a quiet entity chained through Delaware, Wyoming, and the Cayman Islands, has, over the past several years, been picking up the distressed debt portfolios of a former distribution partner that Maybach Music quietly signed with back in the early 2010s. In the kindest reading of the documents, Curtis Jackson bought the paper as a passive investor. In the harder reading, and this is the reading the leaked emails support, Curtis Jackson bought the paper for exactly one reason: to position himself not as Rick Ross's rival, but as Rick Ross's creditor. And that word matters more than every bar Rick Ross has ever recorded. A rival can be out-toured. A rival can be out-charted. A rival can be out-promoted. A creditor can only be paid. This is where the ground splits. Because if you're Curtis Jackson's investment vehicle and you're holding active liens against Rick Ross's original distribution obligations, then every dollar Rick Ross's new album generates, every stream royalty, every ticket settlement, every catalog sync placement, every t-shirt sold at the merch table on the way out, is legally exposed to garnishment the second it hits Maybach Music's accounting pipeline. Let that settle in your chest. Rick Ross wasn't just losing money on this album. Rick Ross was earning money for Curtis Jackson on this album. Every playlist ad, every ad impression, every arena chair, every ringtone in a country he's never even flown over, every last penny. The revenue wasn't heading home to the promised land estate. The revenue was crossing town to G-Unit's finance office. And Curtis Jackson knew it before he sent the first letter. That is why he sent the first letter. He wasn't trying to bury the album. He was trying to inflate the invoice. Curtis Jackson put the punctuation on it himself. Short clip. Private jet cabin. Champagne flute in one hand. Laughing so hard he had to blot his eyes with his cuff. I own you, Ricky. I own you. Every time somebody streams that flop, the check ends up with me. Appreciate the 2,000 sales. I'll pick up my cut Friday morning. The internet did what the internet does. Inside 11 minutes, the tragedy became a meme farm. Rick Ross in a G-Unit polo with an Employee of the Month name tag. Rick Ross photoshopped clocking in at a G-Unit corporate office. Rick Ross in a Wingstop apron edited into a G-Unit warehouse uniform. A Dr. W2 with Curtis Jackson's signature on the pair line. The biggest boss brand, a brand Rick Ross spent 20 years constructing, defending, and monetizing, got vaporized in a single news cycle. And here's the ugly part. The vaporization wasn't the injury. The vaporization was the anesthesia. The actual injury, the financial one, is that Rick Ross now has to pick between performing the album or not performing the album, and both roads lead to a loss. Perform it, Curtis Jackson gets paid. Skip it, the venue overhead and tour bond obligations eat him alive. This is what a checkmate looks like in a modern corporate war room. There's no square left that isn't already owned. Every direction he turns, there's a lien. Every step forward is a garnishment. Every step backward is a default. That's the geometry of a corporate execution, and Curtis Jackson drew the map with a ruler 7 years ago. Want to know how a Maybach music strategist summarized this on a call with a business affairs attorney at 3 in the afternoon? He said it out loud, and the quote leaked before the sun went down. He said, and I'm quoting exactly, "We are not fighting a rap beef anymore. We are fighting a hostile takeover. And we brought a diss track to a debt collection." That sentence is going to end up in a Harvard Business School case study one day. And somewhere in the back row, a 22-year-old with a rap dream is going to hear it and finally understand why the paperwork always outranks the punchlines. Now the story turns darker. Rick Ross's legal team did what any cornered organization does. They filed. Late in the afternoon, Ross's attorneys announced an emergency federal lawsuit alleging tortious interference, predatory corporate harassment, and illegal restraint of trade. They petitioned a federal judge for an immediate injunction against Curtis Jackson's debt enforcement mechanism. On paper, it's the correct move. Any competent legal team would file it. But paper doesn't know Curtis Jackson. Paper doesn't flinch. Paper only knows what it was drafted to know. And Curtis Jackson's paper was drafted by attorneys who've been quietly preparing for exactly this filing for years. His counsel fired back with one sentence. One. And it froze the entire Maybach music war room mid-stride. Quote, "We welcome the litigation. Discovery will require Mr. Roberts to submit 10 years of unedited tax returns and offshore financial records under penalty of perjury." End quote. Let that line hang in the air. Because that's not a legal response. That's a nuclear button under glass. Curtis Jackson isn't saying he'll beat Rick Ross in court. Curtis Jackson is saying he'll crack open Rick Ross's books in court, and everything Rick Ross has spent 2 decades keeping in a locked drawer becomes a matter of public record. For a man whose entire brand is scaled around the appearance of enormous wealth, discovery isn't a legal risk. It's an existential one. If those tax returns confirm what the industry has been whispering for 10 years, that the promised land estate is heavily leveraged, that the Wingstop franchises are on a co-signed line, that the jet is a lease, that the offshore holdings are dressed up thinner than the reps say, Rick Ross doesn't lose a lawsuit. Rick Ross loses the mythology. And in this business, the mythology is the collateral. There is no comeback from a discovered bank statement. The instant those documents hit the docket, every promoter, every festival buyer, every A&R starts pricing him like a used luxury car with a title problem. Take a breath here, folks. Because now we get to the piece that turns this whole thing from a hostile financial siege into a full historic corporate hostile takeover. This is the piece that's going to keep music lawyers awake for the next 6 months. At 5:45 Eastern this afternoon, a corporate registry filing surfaced out of Florida. A newly formed investment group, organized under a Delaware LLC, registered agent in Tallahassee, filing counsel in Miami, submitted a formal buyout offer for the entire Maybach Music Group trademark portfolio and catalog rights. The filing states the group has already picked up a controlling position in Maybach Music's underlying debt obligations from a mix of institutional lenders and secondary debt buyers. If Rick Ross defaults on his upcoming liability payments, which, given the tour freeze and the streaming audit and the venue holds, is not a hypothetical, that's a Tuesday, the investment group is positioned to convert that debt directly into equity. Ownership. The brand. The catalog. The masters. The logo. The whole ecosystem. The whole 17-year story priced at the number stamped on a foreclosure docket. Sit with that valuation for a minute. Because the number on a foreclosure docket is never the number the artist thinks his empire is worth. The seller isn't in the room. The buyer isn't emotional. And the price is always lower than the mythology. Read this next part slow. Because this is where the whole room goes silent. The principal managing director listed on that Florida corporate filing, chief legal counsel at G-Unit Film and Television. Which means the vehicle acquiring Maybach Music isn't a passive investor. The vehicle acquiring Maybach Music is a strategic acquisition arm wired directly into Curtis Jackson's personal corporate structure. Curtis Jackson isn't only blacklisting Rick Ross from the music industry. Curtis Jackson is legally purchasing the empire that made Rick Ross Rick Ross. If the buyout closes and given the debt position, the venue collapse, and the timing, if is doing very light work, Curtis Jackson will own the Maybach Music Group name, the back catalog, the master rights, and the entire branding infrastructure of every project stamped with that logo since 2009. He will own the logo itself. He will own the trademark. He will own the tour name. He will own the merch line. Meek Mill signed to that ecosystem. Will signed to that ecosystem. Stally, O'Malley, Rocky Fresh, a whole generation of artists routed their careers through that logo. And if Curtis Jackson owns the trademark, Curtis Jackson owns the retroactive branding rights on every project it ever kissed. This is where the industry started whispering the word no executive wants to say out loud. Precedent. Because if this works, and it is working, then the hostile takeover template for a hip-hop label just got proven in real time. It just got its case study. Every legacy artist with a leveraged catalog just felt an ice-cold draft on the back of their neck. Now let me give the counterargument its full airtime, because you deserve both sides of the table. There's a serious camp, not a troll camp, a real one arguing that Curtis Jackson just weaponized private equity in a way that endangers every independent black-owned label in the game. If a media mogul can quietly acquire the distressed debt of a competitor, engineer a public revenue collapse, and then flip that debt into ownership at the moment of default, then no independent label is actually independent. That's not paranoia. That's Wall Street. That's what leveraged buyouts have looked like on that side of Fifth Avenue for 40 years. What's new is watching it happen inside hip-hop in real time, with the executioner narrating the play-by-play from a jet cabin holding a champagne flute. Whether you cheer it or you condemn it, you have to admit, something structural just moved. And structural moves don't move back. The other camp, Team Curtis Jackson, and it's a big camp, argues this was earned. They argue Rick Ross had 17 years to sharpen his corporate game the way Curtis Jackson sharpened his, and instead he sharpened his catering budget. They argue that bragging about ownership on wax for a decade and a half without holding real structural equity is exactly the kind of costume that eventually gets stripped off in a boardroom. They argue Curtis Jackson didn't cheat. He read the game. Both camps are correct on their own turf. Both camps miss the deeper story. The deeper story isn't Curtis Jackson versus Rick Ross. The deeper story is that hip-hop just crossed a threshold. For 30 years, the culture told itself beefs were about bars, respect was about catalog, legacy was about influence. In one afternoon, Curtis Jackson demonstrated the currency has changed. The currency is corporate leverage. And if you haven't been stacking it in silence, you don't own it. And if you don't own it, a man who's been stacking it for a decade can walk up to your door with a folder and a smile and a stamp, and you won't have a single move to make. You won't even have a friend in the room, because the person who owns the room is the person who bought the room. Put your call in the comments, because the culture is genuinely split on this one, and I want to know where you land. Did Curtis Jackson just deliver the most strategically ruthless executive maneuver hip-hop has ever produced? Is Rick Ross a cautionary tale about talking ownership without building ownership? Is this the moment private capital finally cracked open the last independent corner of the music business? Or, and this is the argument I want you to steelman for me, is this the 17-year payback Curtis Jackson has been owed since 2008, delivered with the precision of a man who understands that the loudest revenge is the one that arrives in a manila envelope? I want the raw take. Not the polite one. The one you'd voice note your best friend at midnight. Drop it in the thread. Here's the answer to the question you're already typing. Can Rick Ross survive this? The financial answer is complicated. The optical answer is not. Financially, Rick Ross still has assets. Real estate. Franchises. Income streams outside the Maybach Music trademark. He is not a broke man. But optically, the biggest boss brand, the brand, was the whole equity. And that brand is currently being repriced by strangers in a Miami filing office who don't care about a hot 16. That's the trap door he fell through this week, and nobody in his camp has a ladder long enough to reach him. Let me widen the lens one more time, because you deserve the historical parallel. There's exactly one moment in hip-hop history that rhymes with what we're watching. Mid-2000s, when Master P watched his no-limit empire get eaten alive by distribution disputes and tax liens. The culture called it a personal failure. It wasn't. It was a structural failure. Master P built a brand faster than he built the corporate frame to hold it, and when the frame gave, the brand went with it. Curtis Jackson was a young artist watching that unfold. Curtis Jackson took notes. Curtis Jackson learned the exact lesson the industry prayed nobody would learn, that the death of a rap empire is almost never the music. It's almost always the paperwork. And Curtis Jackson has been reverse engineering that lesson into a weapon for 20 years. What you're watching this week is not a beef reaching its climax. What you're watching this week is Curtis Jackson delivering the finished draft of a thesis he started writing in 2003. There's one more piece I have to give you before we close, and this piece changes what you thought this video was about. Because up to this second, the story has been Curtis Jackson versus Rick Ross. That is not the whole story. The whole story is that Curtis Jackson just handed the industry the playbook for the next decade of hip-hop corporate warfare. And every executive at every major label is downloading that playbook tonight. Sources at two competing labels confirmed on background that internal memos went out this evening ordering legal teams to audit their exposure to legacy artist catalogs currently held under co-signed distribution agreements. Read that twice. Because what that memo says in plain English is check who owes what to whom and check whether Curtis Jackson's model could be executed against our artists next. Curtis Jackson didn't just take Rick Ross down. Curtis Jackson taught the industry that the takedown is repeatable. And there are at least 8 legacy artists. I won't name them tonight, but I'll name every single one of them in the next breakdown, whose catalog structure looks disturbingly similar to what Rick Ross's looked like on Monday morning. 8 men who used to sleep soundly. 8 men not sleeping tonight. 8 men whose lawyers are drafting the same emergency memo Rick Ross's lawyers were drafting 6 hours ago. Here's the part that should chill you all the way through. I've been on the phone for the last 3 hours with people I trust, and every single one of them told me the same thing in different words. This was never about Rick Ross. Rick Ross was the demonstration. Rick Ross was the pilot episode. Rick Ross was Curtis Jackson proving the concept to a room full of investors who now have a template, a case study, and a proof of concept. And once you have a template, you don't stop at one target. You stop when you run out of targets. Which means the next 12 months in this business are not going to look like the last 12 months. The next 12 months are going to look like a season of a corporate crime drama that Curtis Jackson himself would executive produce. Because in a way, he already is. Alright folks, we're landing the plane. But stay with me for 30 more seconds, because the next 72 hours are everything. If a federal judge signs off on the injunction Rick Ross's team filed this afternoon, the debt garnishment mechanism gets paused and Curtis Jackson has to slow the roll. If that judge denies the injunction, the trademark buyout window swings open and Maybach Music Group changes hands before the end of the fiscal quarter. 2 outcomes. 1 binary ruling. 1 federal judge in a Florida courtroom. And whichever way that gavel falls, the shockwave hits every catalog owner in this game. Do not let anybody spin this into a personal beef. That framing is a lie of omission. This is a leveraged buyout wearing beef clothing. That was always the trick. That was always going to be the trick. Hit the subscribe button, because this story is not slowing down for anybody. Turn the bell on, because I've got sources placing the injunction hearing inside the next 48 to 72 hours, and I won't sleep until the ruling is in your ear the second it drops. This is unfolding as I speak. I've got people inside 3 of the parent companies. I've got people inside too of the legal firms. I've got a friend who works catering at the venue where the emergency Maybach meeting was held tonight, and I know exactly what time the last black SUV rolled out of the parking structure. The second the courtroom moves, we're moving with it. Part 2 is already in production. Part 2 is where I name the 8 other legacy artists whose catalogs might be next. Part 2 is where I map, layer by layer, the offshore corporate structure Curtis Jackson's investment vehicle actually sits on. Part 2 is where I read you the 7-page contract clause from 2011 that made every dollar of this possible. Once you see that diagram, you'll understand this was never a beef and was never going to be anything except this. Put your verdict in the comments. Did Curtis Jackson finally deliver the 17-year receipt, or did he weaponize private capital against Black-owned music in a way we're all going to regret in 5 years? Did Rick Ross deserve this, or did the culture just watch a public execution dressed up as a rap feud? Did the industry get exposed, or did it get schooled? I'm reading the comments tonight. I'm replying to the sharpest takes personally. Tell me who wins. Tell me who loses. Tell me what happens to a culture that just watched a man buy his rival's empire and etch his name onto the front door of the building. Whatever you think the answer is, I promise you the truth is going to be uglier, sharper, and more historically consequential than anything you've watched in this business in 20 years. And I'll be the one bringing you the ruling the second it drops. Keep your eyes right here. Stay sharp. Stay skeptical. And whatever you do, don't look away. Because in this industry, the blink is when the empire changes hands, the boss becomes an employee, and the 17-year invoice finally gets stamped paid in full.